Welcome to the show. Towards the end of 1609, Chief Powhatan grew tired of the English at Jamestown. After adopting John Smith and trying to incorporate the English into his domain, this group of strangers refused to give Chief Powhatan the guns he so desired. They continued to trade with Powhatan's rivals and now settled beyond the bounds of Jamestown, which Chief Powhatan told them specifically not to do. He forbade any subservient chiefs known as werewances from trading food to the people of Jamestown. Being few in number, he hoped they would either leave or starve to death. But on occasion, boats would appear and deliver more men to Jamestown from England. One such boat in 1609 took John Smith back to England, leaving everyone to deal with the problems he helped create. Smith avoided an attempt on his life, orchestrated by Powhatan, and another attempt by Powhatan's brother, Opechancanough, who we're going to come to know very well. Smith then used violence to extract maize from different Powhatan groups, and an undeclared war began, known to historians today as the First Anglo-Powhatan War, opening up this episode of the podcast. Now, picking up the story in September of 1609, the English settled near the Nansemons tribe, a Powhatan group, faced with the same infamous food shortages as the original settlement at Jamestown. Now here, many of the English simply abandoned the effort and sought to live with the Nansemons tribe, where at least they could find food. The English, out looking for these deserters, came upon the corpses of 13 of these men, killed by the Nansemons. Their mouths were then stuffed with food and their bodies left together in a conspicuous fashion to send a message to the English that they were not welcome here and would never be fed. Such a sight caused the English to abandon the small settlement and flee back to Jamestown. Soon after, Chief Powhatan sends his English envoy, a boy named Thomas Savage, who Powhatan adopts, and 4 Powhatan men to Jamestown to announce that he will trade food to the starving English. Governor Ratcliffe, relieved, took 50 men to trade for food at Powhatan's capital of Oropakes. The Powhatan enthusiastically made trades with the men, luring them away for side deals and then killing them. Governor Ratcliffe himself is taken captive and tied to a stake. Powhatan women then flayed off his skin using the sharp ends of little shells, taking the strips and burning them in a fire directly in front of Ratcliffe. When his body was fully de-skinned, Ratcliffe, still alive somehow, was thrown directly into the fire, putting him out of his misery. Of the 50 men who left Jamestown with Governor Ratcliffe, only 16 returned. Without a governor, the colonists now turned to Deputy Governor Francis West, who went to the Patawomeck people on the edge of the Powhatan domain to trade for food. Tensions being high, the meeting turned into a battle, and a number of the Patawomeck were killed. Deputy Governor West managed to recover some food, loaded it onto his boat, and then fled with his crew back to England. For Chief Powhatan, everything looked favorable for his inevitable final victory over the English. Jamestown now only had about 220 starving Englishmen. His paramount chiefdom had as many as 100 times that population. And in a single season, these few Englishmen had lost 3 governors. And they were now entering the winter of 1609-1610, a period in the history of Jamestown we call the Starving Time. To further accelerate their demise over winter, Chief Powhatan has the English boats untethered from their moorings outside of Jamestown, and he has all the English hogs on the aptly named Hog Island slaughtered. Any English who strayed from Jamestown searching for food were killed, and any who came to a Powhatan village, even with trade goods, received the same treatment. At Jamestown, the food ran out. The people began eating rats and snakes. They boiled their shoe leather to eat. Then when they ate all their rats and dogs and cats and horses, the wealthy boiled their starched clothing to drain off a sort of gray, empty soup. And then the cannibalism began. Bodies of the dead were dug up and eaten. In one case, a man killed his pregnant wife in order to eat her. He was found guilty, of course, and executed. At the end of this horrifying winter, only 61 English remained. They hold a vote and agreed to abandon Jamestown. And on June 7th, 1610, they board their few remaining ships and leave. Chief Powhatan had won his war. But just downriver, at the very edge of Powhatan's domain, new Governor Thomas West and his ships intercept the Jamestown deserters and turn them back upstream, and Jamestown begins again. Now, this episode, as best as I can, is from Powhatan's point of view, and this moment must have been truly dismal for the great king. After a year of trying to subjugate, adopt, and integrate the English, followed by a year of fighting, it seemed to have all paid off. The English were leaving, only to be suddenly undone, and now Jamestown had 375 people. Now, Powhatan only had knowledge of the English within his domain and did not know exactly where England was or how many people lived there. He will learn these things at a later time. But there are those who criticize Powhatan today for not slaughtering the English at these vulnerable moments in the past. But given the same set of knowledge, it is likely you would have made similar decisions. At this point, it still appeared that there were far more Powhatan in the world than English. Also, it is worth mentioning that the English weren't the only issue Chief Powhatan had to tackle during his reign. He had enemies and rival chiefdoms outside of his own, and internally, he had his own rivalries. The English were just one small, now medium-sized problem. The English back at Jamestown were now under the command of Governor West, a man better known to history as Thomas West, the 3rd Baron Delaware. His father and the 2nd Baron Delaware was a figure in the court of Queen Elizabeth, the late Queen Elizabeth, and his mother was a first cousin once removed from Queen Elizabeth, serving in her court as well. Needless to say, Thomas West was a man of some means and many connections. He also possessed the willpower to use these resources effectively. He will become a more formidable opponent to Chief Powhatan than Smith or Governor Ratcliffe. And he won't be in the colony for very long, but will continue to appoint competent deputy governors in his stead for years to come. In reoccupying Jamestown, it became clear to Governor West that the Powhatan were carrying on an undeclared war against the English. He would respond in kind. He reorganized Jamestown around a military model, appointing captains who would oversee a group of 50 men each. On July 6th, 1610, a group of Keegaton natives, a Powhatan group whose chief was Powhatan's own son named Pawkins, took an Englishman named Humphrey Blunt right off of his boat near Fort Comfort, and they killed him. 3 days later, Governor West sent out a small force who put one of their own out in the open as bait, drawing out the Keegatons, and descended upon the warriors, killing 5. They then gave chase and ran the Keegatons out of their own village. The Powhatan warriors still tried to pick off Englishmen as they went in and outside of Jamestown. Governor West captured a few of these warriors, 2 of which were the Werowance of the village of Warraquoisac, along with his son, who would be sent to England. Another man they captured had his hands cut off and sent him back to Powhatan, demanding that the raids stop, the stolen goods be returned, along with any English captives. Chief Powhatan sends word that these attacks are undertaken by the most unruly of his subjects, and that the English should stay only at Jamestown as previously commanded, leave his lands completely, or be killed. Furthermore, he commands that they no longer send word his way unless they provide him with an English carriage and 3 horses. In our last episode, Powhatan demanded the English build him a European-style house. Now here in this episode, he's demanding a carriage and horses. Powhatan obviously saw the show of prestige and having a carriage even across the cultural barrier we see here. Governor West responds by cutting various appendages off his Powhatan captives, sending them back to Powhatan with the message that if his English captives were not returned, he would continue to mutilate the Powhatan warriors he captured and begin burning down villages. Chief Powhatan now had a clear belligerent in his midst. Any facade he had of ruling paramount over the English in the eyes of his subjects were now washed away. But as terrible as Governor West was for Powhatan, it was around this time that a young farmer named John Rolfe arrived at Jamestown, carrying with him tobacco seeds, likely from Trinidad, a strain of the plant that tasted sweeter and gave a smoother draw than the tobacco of the Powhatan and their neighbors. In the long run, this plant will do more harm to the Powhatan than any single governor of Virginia. But Chief Powhatan had little time to consider future threats, as Governor West takes a force to attack the Pashpaheg, where they kill 15 or 16, and then they take a woman and her children hostage, who the English considered to be the queen of this village, either the wife of a Werowance or a Werowance squaw in her own right, in other words, a female chief. Taking them by boat, the English threw her children into the water and then shot them dead in front of her. Later, returning to Jamestown, they put her to the sword, ending her misery. How could Chief Powhatan negotiate with such men? In most native cultures of the East Coast, women and children were taken and adopted in times of war, not very often killed. Such was a way to grow your own numbers and deplete the population of your enemy. Similarly, captive women, married off in a somewhat amicable manner, could create the first bonds of a new peace between two groups. When the English went about killing women and children, they sent a clear signal to Chief Powhatan that the English saw no value in intermarriage, much like how John Smith saw no value in his own adoption. Historians often question why Chief Powhatan didn't make a decisive strike at this moment to stamp out the English threat. But in the fall of 1610, the Powhatan people were harvesting their maize. This was not a time for war. And if the winter of 1610-1611 proved as difficult for the English as the starving time from the year before, come the spring, Chief Powhatan might be able to walk straight into Jamestown without resistance. The English took notice that as the weather cooled, so did the Powhatan attacks. Governor West had enough provisions to see his men through winter, an unfortunate fact for Chief Powhatan that he was unaware of, and the governor did not need to raid villages for food. Instead, during this winter, he sent out a group of men to search for gold mines, including a number of experts in mineralogy hired by the Virginia Company of London. They came upon members of the Appomattox tribe, a Powhatan group, who invited the men to their village. This, of course, was a trap, and the Appomattox slew 14 of the English, including all of the experts and a nephew of the governor himself. A victory for the Powhatan, they sang a song of victory as they chased the survivors back to Jamestown. Around this time, an English boy named Henry Spelman, who was previously given to Chief Powhatan, ran away from him and went to live among the Patawomack people, who were part of Powhatan's paramount chiefdom, but only on the periphery, and will harbor young Thomas. The Patawomack were beginning to turn away from Chief Powhatan. Then, towards the end of the winter, in February of 1611, the Werowance of the Pashpahag, the man whose wife and children were murdered last summer, is killed in a skirmish with the English. After this, the Pashpahag are absorbed by other Powhatan villages and cease to exist as a distinct people. For Chief Powhatan, the winter proved to be one of consolidation, and Jamestown was now more than a minor nuisance. It is known that in this year, the Powhatan made a peace with their traditional enemies, the Monacans, a clear sign that the times were changing. In March of 1611, Governor West left Jamestown to return to England. From here on out, he will govern remotely through deputies. The Powhatan, ever watchful, attacked Jamestown the day after the governor's departure, killing about a dozen English before retreating. All in all, the English now numbered about 170 after this attack. This seemed to be a costly and yet effective strategy to eliminate the English. But then in May of 1611, more boats arrived with 300 more Englishmen under the command of the new deputy governor, Thomas Dale. And then in August of 1611, Sir Thomas Gates arrives with another 300 or so Englishmen and reclaimed his position as deputy governor. The English now numbered 750 or more, far too large for little Jamestown. Dale and Gates resolved to expand once again, and this time they decide to invade the territory of the Arahotek, a Powhatan people, and build Fort Henrico. To counter the English here, the local Werowance named Nematanu carried out a fierce campaign against the builders of the new settlement, making the work a hellish experience. Many of the English abandoned the site, and even a few joined Nematanu to live among his people. The English here came to respect Nematanu, a fierce fighter who seemed to be impervious to English weapons. They referred to him as Jack of the Feathers because of his over-the-top headdress, unmatched by even Powhatan himself, and uncharacteristically ornate for the natives of this particular region. Around the same time, Sir Thomas Dale attacks the Nan Simmons people, the same tribe that once stuffed food into the faces of the English that they killed in order to mock their hunger. Dale and 300 Englishmen run the Nan Simmons out of their own towns and villages, and they burn them over. Entering the winter of 1611-1612, the English still numbered 650 individuals. They were expanding outward and even clearing land to plant their own supply of corn for next year. Then in late December, the English spread out from Henrico, and they run the Appomattox tribe, the tribe that massacred the English search party the year before, out of their territory, and they established the Bermuda Hundred between the James and the Appomattox River. It had become clear to Powhatan that the English avenged every injury they incurred many times over, and it became evident that for the English, every season was warring season. The Powhatan now spent the year 1612 licking their wounds, keeping their distance from the English, and trying to not cause an incident that would incite violence, and thus enable the English to justify the taking of more land for themselves. The English used this lull in the First Anglo-Powhatan War to woo the Patawomecs, a nation again living on the edge of Powhatan's domain, away from being a Powhatan tributary to allies with themselves, thus securing a local seller of corn. It is Captain Samuel Argall who forges this relationship, and in doing so completely nullifies Powhatan's embargo against selling food to the English. Furthermore, Argall learns that Pocahontas, the name the English knew her by anyway, one of Chief Powhatan's many offspring, lived among the Patawomec. Yes, Pocahontas, the very girl who allegedly saved John Smith from execution in 1608, here in 1612, lived among the Patawomec and no longer with her father. The reasons for this are debated but not mutually exclusive to one another. Pocahontas, now considered a young adult in her culture, may have been married to a man among the Patawomec, thus tying a Powhatan group on the periphery to the center. This would not be unheard of. At the same time, Pocahontas on several occasions sided with the English over her own father, and with the breakout of the First Anglo-Powhatan War, perhaps she was sent away to negate any further aid she could provide to her father's enemies. Some scholars claim that Pocahontas likely lived among the Patawomec as a trade liaison between them and her father. All could be true. For Samuel Argall, however, the reason why she lived among the Patawomec was not as important as the opportunity this now gave him, as the English were led to believe in earlier years that Pocahontas was the most beloved of all of Powhatan's children. Argall had already made an alliance with Japazaws, the Werowance of the Patawomec, ending their subservience to Powhatan. Were Pocahontas merely there as a trade liaison, she likely would have left at this time, but she remained well into the year 1613, when Argall agreed to trade a copper kettle to Japazaws and his wife in return for the capture of Pocahontas, and afterward, the benefit of English protection from Powhatan's wrath. The historian David A. Price writes the following concerning the mindset of Captain Argall.
Argall must have understood that the plot simmering in his brain was aimed at a singularly undeserving victim that was the best friend the English in Virginia ever had.
For a contemporary source, John Smith wrote to Queen Anne of Pocahontas,
"She, next to God, was still the instrument to preserve the colony from death, famine, and utter confusion."
In April of that year, the couple lure Pocahontas onto Argall's boat for a grand feast followed by a nap. When she awoke, the boat was at sea, and she was promptly informed that she would not be allowed to leave English captivity until her father returned all his English prisoners and all the stolen weapons and tools. In the meantime, Pocahontas is taken to Henrico, sometimes recorded as Henricus, to live with Reverend Whitaker and his wife. The couple were expected to further her knowledge of the English language and to instruct her in the Christian religion. It is during this time that she becomes acquainted with the aforementioned John Rolfe, the English farmer who brought the foreign strain of tobacco to Virginia. Now here in 1613, he was harvesting his second crop of tobacco. A man who specialized in farming was a strange sight for Pocahontas. Farming to the Powhatan mostly fell within the domain of women. Furthermore, this man obsessively grew a crop that could not be eaten, but rather was one of great spiritual and medicinal importance to her people. There are those who are drawn to the familiar, and then there are those who are drawn to the exotic. Pocahontas, at every phase of her life, fit the bill of the latter. Powhatan, meanwhile, must have been incensed by the capture of his daughter. In the spring of 1613, the English in Virginia numbered half of what they had 2 years prior. They seemed to be a sickly, weak, dying people. The long waiting game the great chief played seemed to be paying off. His pride would not allow him to acquiesce to the demands of the English. As we heard in our last episode, in Tidewater, Virginia, Chief Powhatan made the demands. He determined the price he would pay for things, and it was he who summoned people, not the other way around. Powhatan would not send the captives and weapons to Jamestown. Rather, he demands the English treat Pocahontas well and deliver her to the village of Machot, his new capital. Only then would they receive that which they desired. The English remain unmoved from their demands, and a week later, Powhatan sends 7 English captives with 7 broken guns, some corn, and some of the stolen tools back to Jamestown. This time, he promises 500 bushels of corn for the return of Pocahontas to Machot, without mentioning any additional guns, tools, or captives. The English again remained unwilling to yield on their demands, and Powhatan had already revealed his hand and seemed willing to give in. However, as the months went by, neither side was willing to satisfy the demands of the other. Finally, in March of 1614, it was the English that gave in. Deputy Governor Dale takes Pocahontas and 150 of his men up the Pamunkey River to Machot. Along the way, the English and the Powhatan break into a skirmish, the Powhatan surprised by the English appearance. The English kill about 12 Powhatan and make it to Machot, where they make signs that they came in peace, while hundreds of Powhatan warriors gathered and stood at the ready. The tension was only broken when 2 men stepped forward from among the Powhatan. These were half-brothers of Pocahontas. Overjoyed, she went to see them, and the Powhatan relaxed, knowing that the English were here to acquiesce to their chief. Here the English learned that Chief Powhatan, the man that they had learned to fear so greatly, was in the process of handing over his power to his younger brother Opechancanough, bypassing his direct heir Opechapam, who was deemed physically and or mentally unfit to lead. He would hold title, but Opechancanough would have the real power. And indeed, it appears he already assumed much of his brother's authority. Some suggest Opechancanough forced his succession onto his elderly brother. Opechancanough tells the English that his brother will honor any agreement that the two groups make here and now. And with this, we have the beginning of the end of the conflict. It was assumed by all but 2 that Pocahontas would now stay here with her family. But before John Rolfe could say anything, Pocahontas tells her people that she is upset with her father, who loved old swords over his own daughter, and that she will now live with an Englishman who indeed loved her. A twist, and perhaps a deal breaker for the newfound peace, John Rolfe then nervously hands Deputy Governor Dale a letter, wherein he asks the governor for permission to marry Pocahontas. In his words, to whom my hearty and best thoughts are and have a long time been so entangled. Opechancanough would defer to his brother for approval of the marriage, but allowed Pocahontas to return to the English as she desired. With this, the First Anglo-Powhatan War came to a truce. The nurturing of the peace, however, came with the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe. The historian Camilla Townsend writes the following about Pocahontas' decision. She was keenly intelligent and had been living among the English long enough to have begun to grasp the resources they had at their disposal. If her people were to survive, they needed the English as allies, not enemies. How did an Algonquian woman build an alliance? In a time-honored custom, she married with the enemy and bore children who owed allegiance to both sides. It is certainly possible Pocahontas loved John Rolfe, but it is undeniable that Pocahontas knew the political benefits to creating a bridge between the two peoples. And indeed, historian Daniel Richter argues that Pocahontas created the kinship tie that her father failed to do when he adopted John Smith. The men resolved the war, but Pocahontas would create the peace. Word came to the English that Chief Powhatan agreed to the marriage. After all, he now had a daughter who could keep an eye on the English for him, and he sent a maternal uncle of Pocahontas named Opechisco and 2 of Pocahontas' brothers to attend the ceremony. They were married April 14th, 1614, and Pocahontas, who formerly went by the names Amanute and Mataoka, and informally as Pocahontas, underwent conversion and adopted the Christian name Rebecca. The changing of names was common among the Powhatan and often signaled the changing of status that an individual might have progressing through life. The Powhatan also could use different names concurrently for close family and more distant acquaintances. Rebecca would now be the newest addition to her complex identity. Soon after the marriage, the Chickahominy people, fiercely independent from the Powhatan, pledged themselves as subjects to the English. In doing so, they protected themselves from Powhatan's attacks and avoided a scenario wherein both the English and Powhatan turned to them for the spoils of war. About a month after the marriage, Chief Powhatan at Machot was surprised to see two Englishmen visit his capital. The first was Ralph Haymore, and the second was a young man named Thomas Savage, who years ago lived among Powhatan as an adopted son and interpreter. They were sent to secure another daughter of Powhatan for Deputy Governor Dale to marry. Powhatan then referred to Dale as his brother, a common familial term among East Coast native groups for an allied chief indicating equal status. He claims he cannot spare the other daughter in question, as he had already accepted 2 bushels of beads from a werowance for her marriage. Although he does express here that he is happy for Pocahontas and her new marriage. Through Thomas, Haymore records Powhatan's message to the English. It goes as follows.
I am now old, and would gladly end my days in peace. So as if the English offer me inquiry, my country is large enough, I will remove myself further from you.
And with this, in his own way, he let it be known that he would not be the one in charge of relations between the two peoples, and that, frankly, he probably didn't care for the English that much anymore. Opechancanough would now lead the Powhatan. And to further consolidate power, Opechancanough himself takes a daughter of Chief Powhatan as his own bride. As speculated in the last episode, many believe Opechancanough was only a paternal brother, or perhaps just a cousin to Chief Powhatan. This marriage would further lend credence to the idea that the two men did not share a close maternal relation. This other daughter of Powhatan was referred to the English as Cleopatra, that being their nickname for her anyway. Relations now normalized between the Powhatan and the English. Opechancanough made it a capital offense to steal from the English. And the great medicine man and Powhatan's own son-in-law, Utamatomakan, even informed the English that he personally killed a man for stealing English goods. 2 years go by of unbroken peace. Pocahontas and John Rolfe have a child they name Thomas, and the Virginia Company secures passage for the Rolfes to visit England, along with a large party of Powhatan to serve as diplomats of their people, hoping to secure an audience with the king. Many in this group were Pocahontas' own family, her brother-in-law, Utamatomakan, her sister, and Utamatomakan's wife, Matachana, and I know I'm mispronouncing a lot of these words. I'm trying to say them as correctly as possible, but I'm not perfect, and a number of other female relatives. There were also a couple of Powhatan of lesser status who were sent over to be servants to the chief's family. Interviewed in England by Samuel Purchas, Utamatomakan explains that he was tasked by his father-in-law, or perhaps Opechancanough, with gathering information on the English. Supposedly, he was to count the English to get an idea of how many there were. He should try to meet the great chief of the English himself, the king, and see the English god. He was to find out if the English had much food, as they always seemed to be desperate for it in Virginia, and he was to report back on how forested England was, as the English seemed to marvel at the trees and their size, as if it was rare in their land to have trees. He told Purchas that he prayed to the Oki of his village, and it told him that the voyage would be longer than expected, but he went out of a sense of duty to England. He also expressed that he was impressed with the English agriculture, because based on his experience of the men at Jamestown, he assumed that the English were a miserable, hungry lot who barely knew how to plant anything. The Powhatan must have been shocked by the size, the scale of London, having around 200,000 residents about this time. This one English settlement alone was many times greater in population than all of the Powhatan villages combined. This fact will not be lost on Utamatomakan. The Powhatan did not secure an official audience with King James, but they were received by him at a more informal gathering. Utamatomakan did not believe he met the real King James, as the king was not physically strong or a large man, such as would be expected for a ruler over so many people. King James also gave him no gifts, very unbecoming of a great chief meeting an emissary. As for Pocahontas, she had her last meeting with John Smith, which is only detailed in Smith's own account, so keep that in mind. Pocahontas was told in 1609 that her adopted brother, John Smith, had died. She was now furious to learn that she had been lied to. Smith himself was a somewhat embarrassed figure because of his own fallen status, having recently been let go as Admiral of New England. New England being a name he first applied to the English maps, to an area they formerly called the North of Virginia, or Norumbega. He even labeled the harbors. John Smith named one such place Plymouth, after the port in England where the Virginia Company of Plymouth operated, soon to become the Council for New England. Such distinctions and status were lost on Pocahontas and didn't matter to the Powhatan. Interesting to note here, Tisquantum, known to the English as Squanto of Plymouth fame, lived in England at this time, not very far from where the Powhatan stayed. It's not known if they ever met or were arranged to meet one another. Both spoke Algonquian languages, but very distant in terms of the dialectical continuum. They wouldn't have been able to actually communicate in Algonquin and would have had to speak English to one another. But again, we don't know if they met. We don't know if information was exchanged. Just one of those things that people like me dwell on, right? Pocahontas, here in England, served in a role that many modern writers label as a model native, willing to marry an Englishman, be industrious to the benefit of the English markets, and accept Christian conversion. She was a marketing tool for tobacco and the Virginia Company. That's one way of looking at it, and there are parts of that are certainly true, right? And yet, Samuel Purchas at the time, he writes that Pocahontas still carried herself as a daughter of the king, commanding natural respect. It is here that we have the only known image of Pocahontas that was made during her life, referring to her both as Mataoka and Rebecca, and acknowledging her as the princess of the Imperator of Virginia. In this engraving, Pocahontas is wearing clothes of the upper-class English at the time, and her face is quite different than that which you may have seen in a Disney movie, let's say. She isn't a playful child, but a proud, serious woman, representing in England her people, whose peaceful relations with the English were now largely her creation, for better or worse. Now, it is nearly impossible to talk about Pocahontas without projecting a modern lens on her, and it's completely impossible to speak on Pocahontas without some speculation because the gaps are so great. This is part of the reason that throughout the series I have been a Pocahontas minimalist, as I believe the narrative around Pocahontas has completely overshadowed the story of her sisters, her father, her uncle, and every Powhatan descendant tribe and tribal member up to this present day. And it is here that she leaves our story. While departing for Virginia, Pocahontas dies from a respiratory illness in March of 1617. Of the other Powhatan, 3 remained in London too sick to travel. One was a man who died 2 years later, one was a woman who died on a return voyage to Virginia, and a third woman eventually married a man in Bermuda. After that, I don't know where her story leads. The rest return, most importantly, the man with a mission, Utamatomakin, who became the most vocal opponent of the English among the Powhatan. He had seen firsthand that the English population was simply far beyond the scale of the Powhatan, and having planted themselves among the riverways of the Powhatan, they would now fill in the land to the mountains and beyond. Back in Virginia, and overlapping our visit to England, Deputy Governor Yeardley in 1616 is unable to obtain the promised food from the Chickahominy tribe, as agreed to when the English took them in as tributaries in 1614. The Chickahominy argued that the agreement was made with Deputy Governor Dale, and thus was no longer binding. A small battle occurs between the English and the Chickahominy, and the English retreat without securing any food. They lose the battle. Opechancanough then tells the English that, as their ally, he will fix the problem. His solution is to invade a Chickahominy village and then force their submission to the Powhatan. The English would now get their food, but lose the Chickahominy to the Powhatan paramount chiefdom. For their entire shared history, the Powhatan and the English will only ever be shaky allies at best. When the Powhatan return from England, the former chief Powhatan learns of his daughter's death and is greatly saddened. As an old man, he now travels his country freely and visits the English from time to time. But eventually, he retired to a village the English record as Mayumps, having no fixed location on the English maps. Old World disease ravaged the Powhatan population in several waves over the next 2 years, and the great Chief Powhatan himself passes away in the spring of 1618. Utamatomakin returns to tell Powhatan's brothers Opechapam and Opechancanough the true scale of the English population and other ominous facts he picked up along the way. He grows distant from the English. He, as perhaps the head medicine man of all Powhatan medicine men, becomes a firebrand against English occupation, Opechancanough tells the English that Utamatamakon now lives in disgrace. But as the Powhatan population dwindles and the English ships drop off more and more Englishmen, and as the forests are cleared for more tobacco fields, the writing is on the wall, and Pocahontas' peace will have to give way to war. Opechancanough knows that time is not on the side of the Powhatan. They must strike before the balance is tipped. But until then, they will play nice. Tune in next time. Until then, this has been the Other States of America History Podcast. I'm Eric Yanis. Thank you for listening.